A waitress fed a homeless man and was fired. 30 minutes later, Jason Statham arrived. The entire world was reduced to that auditorium. With trembling hands, Laura adjusted the violin against her neck, feeling the weight of the 3,000 suspended breaths in the rows before her. The silence was so thick it could be cut. Her temples pulsed in time with the wall clock that ticked down the seconds until her entrance. Finally, the conductor raised his baton, eyes fixed on her. 3 deep breaths were not enough. The first, chords of the orchestra began to fill the space, heralding her solo entrance. Laura felt cold sweat trickle down her back as flashbacks of her last fiasco invaded her mind. The baton pointed toward her, her moment arriving in 3, 2, 1. Fingers found the strings. The first note, pure crystalline, floated through the auditorium. The following notes came in perfect succession, dancing with precision as Laura closed her eyes, letting the melody guide her. For an instant, there was only her and Tchaikovsky, communicating across the centuries. Until, at the height of the central cadence, something snapped. It wasn't a sound audible to the audience, but Laura felt it immediately, a subtle tremor in her right wrist, followed by a sharp stab that shot up her arm, the same tremor that had shattered her career 2 years before. The conductor noticed the microscopic hesitation, his eyes meeting hers in a shared moment of panic. Not a single note was lost, but the growing pain in Laura's wrist was a ticking time bomb. The most important solo violin concert of her life, her chance at redemption, was about to collapse. 60 seconds to the final movement, 59, 58. Jason's face, her former mentor, emerged from the front row. His eyes conveyed what his lips could not at that moment. "You can't do it." The same look of disappointment he had shown after her collapse at Carnegie Hall. Laura felt the weight of impending failure, but then her gaze met another pair of eyes in the crowd. In the third row center, a boy of about 12 watched her with pure admiration, holding a program in his hand on which her name was printed. The boy who had come to her open rehearsal, asking if he could ever play like her, despite his own partially paralyzed hand. The pain in her wrist intensified, almost unbearable. 20 seconds until the final movement, the moment everyone had awaited, the moment for which she had spent 2 years in physical and psychological therapy preparing. Laura had 2 choices: stop and admit defeat, or continue and risk permanent damage. She adjusted the violin, slightly altering its position, compensating for the sudden weakness. The conductor noticed the subtle movement, the change in technique that hadn't been planned. And then came the moment of truth, the section that had broken her 2 years earlier. 2.5 years ago, Laura Mendez was considered a late-blooming prodigy. At 34, principal violinist of the São Paulo Philharmonic, she had finally earned the recognition she had sought since the age of 7, when she first played the violin. It wasn't a traditional path. Child prodigies usually emerge in their teens. But Laura was different. The only child of a cleaning lady and a factory worker, she grew up in the suburbs of a city where symphony orchestras were something that existed only on television. Her first violin was a birthday gift bought at a thrift store, patiently restored by her father, who, although he had never played any instrument, spent his evenings watching online tutorials to fix it. "You have hands made for music," her mother would say, as they both cleaned houses on weekends to pay for her music lessons. At 17, Laura had been rejected by 3 different conservatories. "Excellent technique, but lacking soul," an evaluator had written. The rejection led her to abandon the violin for almost 5 years, during which she studied business administration and worked at an insurance company, a stable job that paid the bills but drained her soul a little more each day. Until the night she attended a concert by Jason Statham, the renowned British violinist recognized worldwide. The sound emanating from his instrument tore down all the barriers Laura had built. After the concert, in an act of impulsive courage, she stormed into his dressing room. "What do you want?" Jason asked, visibly exhausted. "I want you to teach me how to play with soul," she replied, her eyes brimming with tears. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Jason agreed to listen to her play. And then, after 15 minutes, he offered her a proposal. Private lessons, free of charge, on the condition that she dropped everything to dedicate herself exclusively to music. "There is a dormant ocean in your hands," he said, "but you will have to sacrifice everything to awaken it." The next 3 years were the most intense of Laura's life. She lived in a tiny room, worked as a waitress at night, and practiced the violin for 8 hours a day. Jason was a demanding mentor, often brutally critical, challenging every inch of her technique and interpretation. "Technical perfection is just the ticket to the concert," he would repeat. "Soul is the real performance." At 32, Laura earned a position in the orchestra, and 2 years later she became a soloist. The ocean had finally awakened. Her interpretation of Tchaikovsky at the Municipal Theatre sold out tickets for 3 consecutive nights. Critics described her as a late-blooming revelation but explosive. Then came the invitation to perform at Carnegie Hall, the dream of any classical musician. It was Jason who insisted, "This is your chance to show the world that age is irrelevant when you have something genuine to say." Laura practiced like never before, 16 hours a day, ignoring the initial twinges of pain in her wrist, attributing them to fatigue. Jason noticed the first signs, the slight hesitation in her arpeggios, the extra tension in her shoulders, but both pretended not to see. The opportunity was too great to be postponed. The night at Carnegie Hall began like a dream. The first notes, perfect. Then, in the middle of the second movement, her wrist locked completely. A sharp, paralyzing pain shot through her arm. The sound from her violin resembled more a cry for help. The failure was catastrophic, audible even to untrained ears. Laura saw the horror in the front row, the embarrassment on the conductor's face, and worst of all, the absolute disappointment in Jason's expression. The medical diagnosis came like a sentence: chronic tendinitis aggravated by repetitive strain. "You ignored all the warning signs," the doctor said. "Full recovery is not guaranteed." Jason gradually distanced himself. "You knew the risks and chose to ignore them," were his last words before he cut off his mentorship. What followed was an abyss. Laura sold her apartment to pay for treatments, physiotherapy sessions, acupuncture, alternative therapies, anything that offered hope. For months, she couldn't hold her violin without crying in pain. But then, during a particularly frustrating physiotherapy session, she met Miguel, a 10-year-old boy battling partial finger paralysis after an accident. While she complained about her condition, the boy practiced simple movements tirelessly, celebrating every small progress. "Why do you keep trying?" Laura asked him one day. "Because when I play, even if only 2 notes are right, I feel like I'm speaking a special language," Miguel replied with the disarming simplicity of a child. That struck Laura like a revelation. She had lost herself in the pursuit of technical perfection, forgetting the reason she had started playing. It wasn't about Carnegie Hall or impressing Jason. It was about that special language. Gradually, she developed a new technique, adapted to her limitations. She relearned to play, this time listening to what her body was telling her. After 18 months of recovery, she began teaching children with disabilities, including Miguel, using methods she herself had developed. It was Miguel who encouraged her to audition for the beneficent concert of the National Philharmonic Orchestra, an event to raise funds for children with special needs. "If you don't try," he said, "how can I believe that I should keep trying?" And now, 2 years after the fiasco at Carnegie Hall, Laura was on stage again, facing not only the audience, but her own demons. The pain in Laura's wrist was like a fire climbing up her arm, but her fingers did not stop. She adjusted her posture, redistributing the weight of the instrument, activating secondary muscles she had trained exhaustively during rehabilitation. The modified technique wasn't conventional, certainly not what Jason had taught, but it worked. The notes flowed, different from those rehearsed yet still true to the essence of Tchaikovsky. Conductor Caldera, initially confused by the subtle change in interpretation, adapted quickly, his eyes never leaving Laura's, a silent communication established between them. When the final movement ended, There was a moment of absolute silence before an explosion of applause inundated the auditorium, an immediate standing ovation. Laura saw Miguel in the third row, jumping with excitement, while Jason remained seated, his expression unreadable. Backstage, after 3 curtain calls, Laura finally let the pain show, massaging her wrist as silent tears of relief and exhaustion streamed down her face. "That wasn't Tchaikovsky," came a familiar voice behind her. Jason was standing, in the dressing room doorway, older than she remembered, the wrinkles around his eyes more pronounced. "No," she agreed without apologizing. "It was Tchaikovsky through me, as it should be." A heavy silence settled between them, 2 years of unspoken words hanging in the air. "You changed the fingering in the third movement," he finally commented, approaching hesitantly. "I had to adapt. My wrist will never be the same." And yet, it worked. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from Jason, it was the closest she'd get. Before they could continue, Miguel burst into the dressing room, his eyes shining with admiration. "Laura, you were amazing. Everyone's talking about how different and special it was." Jason observed the interaction between Laura and the boy with curiosity, the natural way she bent down to meet him at his level, the gentleness in her touch as she held Miguel's partially paralyzed hand. "Is that your student?" Jason asked after Miguel left, clutching an autograph on the program. "One of 20, all with some type of physical limitation. I've developed a method for them over the past 2 years." A method? Responsive technical adaptation. It's like relearning how to play, but respecting the individual limitations of the body. Jason was silent for a long moment. "You should document that." "I already am. It's my side project alongside performing." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of conductor Caldera, a 60-year-old man with the energy of a 30-year-old. "Laura, extraordinary. The Berlin Philharmonic was in the audience. They want to talk about a possible European tour." Laura's eyes widened. "Berlin? But do they know about your condition?" "Yes. In fact, they're particularly interested in your work with children. It seems you've created something revolutionary without even realizing it." Jason watched, a mixture of pride and regret in his gaze. "I always knew there was an ocean in you," he murmured almost to himself. 3 weeks later, Laura found herself in her improvised studio, an old warehouse converted into a classroom for her special students. The walls, once grey, now displayed vibrant colors and children's drawings. Violins of different sizes, some modified with special adaptations, occupied a rack on the wall. Miguel was struggling with a particularly challenging passage, his brow furrowed in concentration, his partially paralyzed fingers fighting to hit the notes. Laura watched, resisting the impulse to intervene. "I can't do it," he finally said, lowering the violin in frustration. "You can't do it the traditional way," Laura gently corrected. "So let's find your way." She picked up her own violin, demonstrating an alternative approach she had developed specifically for Miguel's condition. "See? Music doesn't care about the path you take to reach it. It only cares that you get there." As they worked on the adaptation, the studio door opened. Jason entered, seeming out of place among the colorful instruments and children's decorations. "I have a proposal," he said without preamble after observing the class for a few minutes. "The National Academy is interested in your method. They want you to develop a formal teaching program for children with special needs." Laura paused, lowering her violin. "The same academy that rejected me 3 times?" Jason looked uncomfortably contrite. Institutions evolve, some more slowly than others. Miguel looked between the two, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its origin. "And what would be your role in that, Jason?" Laura asked, her tone cautiously neutral. "Advisor, not to you but to them, to ensure they don't interfere with your process." He paused. "I made a mistake by abandoning you when you needed guidance the most. I'm not asking to be your mentor again. I'm asking to be a colleague." The proposal hung in the air like an unresolved note. Laura turned to Miguel, who had resumed his silent practice, his determination almost palpable. "I'll do it on one condition," she finally replied. The program must be accessible. No eliminatory auditions, no prohibitive fees. I already discussed that with them. They agreed to full scholarships for up to 40% of the students. A reluctant smile formed on Laura's lips. 50%. Jason sighed theatrically. You've always been stubborn. I learned from the best. While they finalized the details of the proposal, Laura's phone rang. It was conductor Caldera. The Berlin Philharmonic had confirmed. They wanted not only the tour, but also a workshop on her method. They're especially interested in how you modified Tchaikovsky, Caldera explained, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. They're calling it an innovative interpretation. After hanging up, Laura looked at Jason, who had overheard part of the conversation. It seems your ocean has finally found its own current, he commented. And you? Laura asked. What do you really think of my modified interpretation? Jason pondered the question for a long moment. I think Tchaikovsky would have approved. Music must adapt to the musician, not just the musician to the music. It was the validation Laura never realized she still needed, not because it came from Jason, but because it came from a place of genuine understanding. Now, Jason continued, gesturing to Miguel, who was still practicing determinedly in the corner, I think you both have an ocean of your own to explore. As Jason departed, Laura observed her young student, realizing how her own journey had transformed not only her relationship with music, but also her understanding of what it meant to be a complete artist. The pain in her wrist would never completely disappear, but it had become part of her story, not its end. 3 months later, Laura was backstage at Philharmonie Berlin, her wrist slightly sore but manageable. The European tour had been an unexpected triumph, with critics describing her method as a silent revolution in musical pedagogy. Today, however, it wasn't Laura who would perform. On the main stage, Miguel and 5 other students from the program waited nervously, each with their instrument adapted to their specific needs. The performance was to be broadcast internationally, as part of a documentary on inclusion in the arts. What if I fail? Miguel whispered, his violin trembling slightly in his hands. Laura knelt in front of him. Remember that wrong note in my rehearsal yesterday? What did it tell me afterward? That there are no wrong notes, only unplanned ones, Miguel recited, a hesitant smile forming. Exactly. She gently squeezed his shoulder. Now go and let your ocean speak. The guest conductor was none other than Jason, who had taken on an unexpected role as an advocate for the program. When the lights dimmed, Laura found her seat in the front row next to the director of the Berlin Philharmonic and representatives from UNESCO who were considering expanding the program globally. The chosen piece was an original composition by Laura, written specifically for the unique abilities of her students. Speaking hands began with a solitary note from Miguel, trembling yet determined, gradually joined by the other young musicians. The beauty of the piece was not in its technical perfection, but in its raw authenticity. Each child played in a way that traditional experts would have considered incorrect, but together they created something profoundly moving. In the middle of the performance, Miguel's wrist locked, exactly as Laura's had on that comeback night. A moment of panic crossed his face, visible to everyone in the front row. Laura held her breath, fighting the urge to rush onto the stage. But then Miguel did something extraordinary. Instead of trying to force his way through the passage as rehearsed, he instantly adapted, modifying his fingering just as Laura had taught him. The other young musicians, trained to respond to changes, adjusted in perfect harmony. Jason, conducting, smiled with pride, following the children's lead rather than imposing structure. Laura felt tears streaming freely down her face. This moment, neither the ovation from her own performance nor the critics' praise, nor even Jason's validation, was her true triumph. Fear had been replaced by possibility, failure transformed into a new language. When the piece ended, there was a moment of reverent silence before the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, some crying openly. The Berlin Philharmonic's director squeezed Laura's arm. "This," he said, voice thick with emotion, "is the future of music." Miguel searched for Laura in the audience, his smile so bright it could light up the entire auditorium. It was the same look of pure joy she had felt years ago when she first played the violin, not for perfection, but for the sheer joy of creating something out of nothing. Jason led the young musicians in a final bow, then gestured for Laura to join them on stage. Hesitant, she climbed the steps, feeling the weight of the moment. "These children," Jason announced into the microphone, "are not the future of music because they overcame limitations. They are the future because they taught us that music has never had limitations, only our perceptions did." He handed the baton to Laura, a symbolic gesture not unnoticed by anyone in the audience. The transition from student to pioneer was complete. As the young musicians gathered around her in a collective embrace, Laura realized that her greatest masterpiece wasn't a flawless performance, but the oceans she had helped awaken in each of them. 3 years later, Laura observed the courtyard of the International Center for Adaptive Music, where dozens of children with diverse abilities practiced under the spring sun. What had begun as an experimental program had become a global movement, with branches in 15 countries. Her wrist still ached on rainy days, a constant reminder of the price she paid for ignoring her body's limits. But the pain had transformed into something different, a teacher, not a tormentor. Jason, now a frequent visitor, was leading a masterclass in the main auditorium. Their relationship had evolved into one of respectful partnership, the scars of the past gradually replaced by mutual understanding. Ready for tomorrow's performance? Miguel, now 15, approached with his violin. His technique had evolved in ways no one could have predicted. His physical limitation transformed into a singular artistic signature. Laura smiled, watching the ocean of possibilities stretching before her, not only for herself, but for everyone who had been taught that there was only one path to excellence. "I'm always ready for a new interpretation," she replied, adjusting her violin against her shoulder, finding the perfect balance between what she had lost and what she had gained. The sound that emerged then was not just music. It was a conversation among all the oceans she had helped awaken, each speaking its own special language, yet together creating something greater than the sum of its parts.